Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Freedom and Fairness, Boards and Prison Labor in the Deep South. This is a part of the Good Trouble Tuesdays collaboration between the Leagues of Women Voters in Alabama and Georgia. And I'm Kim Bailey, president of the League in Alabama. So we're here tonight to talk about something that affects real people every single day. So what we're going to talk about isn't just about policies and processes, it's about people's lives. As you listen to our panelists, I invite you to think about what justice should look like and whether the current system is really delivering it. Now I'm going to hand it over to Nicola for her introduction.
Good evening, everyone. And yes, I'm Nicola Hines, the president of the League of Women Voters of Georgia. And I want to thank our League sisters from Alabama for joining us on our third installment of Good Trouble Tuesday and everyone who's joining us virtually. This series was created to hold space for honest conversations. For honest conversations and about power, policy, and real life impact on decisions. Tonight, we are turning our attentions to pardons, parole, and boards and prison labor, systems that quietly shape thousands of lives across Georgia and Alabama. In Georgia, parole and clemency decisions are made by Georgia State Board pardons and patrols. Sorry, I am so fluttering today. I do apologize. This appointed body has the authority to determine when someone is granted a second chance, and with that authority comes significant responsibilities and important questions about transparency, accountability, and whether rehabilitation is truly centered in our justice system. Here in Georgia, we face high incarceration rates, and prison labor remains embedded in how parts of our state functions. At the League of Women Voters of Georgia, we believe justice must reflect democratic values, fairness, dignity, and meaningful opportunities for reentry. Systems that impact families, communities at this scale deserve public understanding and engagement. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Sarah Shannon, who will guide us through tonight's conversation. Dr. Sarah Shannon is Meigs Distinguished Professor of Sociology, Director of Criminal Justice Studies Programs at the University of Georgia, and conducts high-impact, policy-relevant research in criminal justice that is extensively cited by policymakers, the press, think tanks, and academics. As an interdisciplinary scholar, Dr. Shannon's published research appears in top-ranked peer-reviewed journals across several fields: sociology, criminal justice, health and social welfare, and geography. She's also an award-winning instructor. Her teaching has been recognized with awards for excellence in undergraduate and graduate instructions, research mentoring, creative teaching, and service learning. Prior to academia, Dr. Shannon worked in the nonprofit sector with people impacted by the criminal justice system. This prior experience influences her desire for her scholarly work and teaching to have a positive impact on policies and practice. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Shannon, and thank you for leading us in this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be a part of this really important conversation for both of our states. Indeed, this system of mass incarceration in the United States has had a profound impact on individuals, families, and communities in ways that have also disproportionately affected communities of color. And so today we're going to kind of move beyond the big statistics and really focus in on trying to understand the human cost of this practice of mass incarceration. So we'll discuss things moving from arrest to prison to life behind bars to some of the after effects of incarceration and the process of reentry. So I would like to go ahead and get the discussion started by having each of our panelists introduce themselves. So if we could start with Fallon, that would be wonderful.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize I was starting. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Fallon McClure. I'm the Deputy Southeast Regional Director for Working Families Power. So we work to make sure that everyone has what they need to thrive. So that's, a job that pays your wages adequately, healthcare, all the things. And we advocate through various aspects. I'm really excited to be here today. Working in the criminal justice system and around criminal justice policy has been one of my passions for many years, and I'm excited to share the stage with these amazing panelists.
And next we could have Veronica.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Veronica R. Johnson. I am the Deputy Director of Alabama Justice Initiative. We're located in Birmingham, Alabama, but we do work throughout the state of Alabama. Primarily, our focus is on parole reform, criminal justice reform here in the state of Alabama, as well as social justice reform and civic engagement work. Prior to working in the nonprofit space, I was a juvenile probation officer for 16 years. So my experience is unique in that I've worked both sides of the aisle. And so currently I'm here trying to change a system that has impacted many of the people that I've previously served.
Thank you. Nichelle?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nichelle Cunningham, and I am the paralegal at the ACLU of Alabama. I currently lead our organization's Parole Watch alongside our legal fellow Cortland Meigs. Together, we attend weekly parole and pardon hearings for the state of Alabama, listening closely to stories of the incarcerated and their families while tracking decisions and patterns that often go unseen. Through this work, I have developed a deep expertise in Alabama's pardon and paroles process. I have a strong commitment in ensuring transparency, fairness, and dignity within the Alabama criminal legal system. Throughout my work, I have noticed the disconnect within the incarcerated families speaking in support of their loved ones at parole hearings by not addressing key factors regarding their reentry plan, which typically leads to denials. I created a statewide initiative called Atone in Alabama, which educates families of the incarcerated on how to navigate the parole and pardon process while making the best of their 2 minutes in front of the board. It is my pleasure to speak with you all this evening, and I thank you all for having me today.
Thank you. And we have Doug here. Doug, I think you might need to turn your camera on so we can see you. There you are.
All right, that's right. Hey, everyone, my name is Doug Amar. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Justice Project in Atlanta. I'm sitting right behind, in the Old Fourth Ward, right behind the King Center, where our office has been for most of our 40 years. Our organization is 40 years old this year. I've been actually here full-time for 35 of those years, actually coming up on 36. But our work is all focused primarily, it's all criminal justice, criminal legal system related. And primarily what we do is we represent people, work with people, and with the front end of the system and the back end of the system. And we also, about 20 years ago, decided to go upstream and work on policy. So we've been doing that work very aggressively and have gotten about 24 bills through Georgia, have 3 pending right now. Hopefully they're going to make it this year. And we do a ton of work with folks that sort of volunteers. We have about 250 lawyers who volunteer with us and handle cases. We work with folks in the parole setting, the prison setting. And as a criminal defense lawyer, we're trying to keep people out of the system. So that's where we start a lot of our work. Anyway, I'll share more later. Great to be here tonight. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I know since we are focusing sort of on our 2 different states, I wondered if one of you from each setting might just sort of set the stage for us with some opening remarks about what the landscape looks like as it pertains to some of these issues. So Veronica, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Alabama perspective here?
Sure. So in Alabama, we've gone through some drastic changes over the years. There's currently a crisis within not only our prison system, but our parole system as well. So within the last 10 years, our parole release rates have plummeted severely. So we went from about a 43% grant rate to somewhere around a 17% grant rate. And that's on the high end on any good day. Some days it can be way, way lower than that. We've just gone through various changes within the parole board, meaning we've gone from, we've had 2 different parole board heads within the past 5 years. And that's because of lack of transparency, lack of their ability to do what they're supposed to do in terms of a parole board. There are certain rules, there are certain guidelines that they're supposed to be following, and they aren't following those rules. We also have a risk assessment tool that's supposed to be used in determining whether or not a person will be a high, low, or a medium, high, or low risk factor once they're released into the community. Our parole board oftentimes overlook those recommendations and then make their decisions based on whatever they want to make their decisions on, which results in more low risk offenders remaining behind the wall. That's typically what they refer in prison, in any locked facility, and moderate risk offenders being let out at a higher rate, which is a huge problem here in the state of Alabama. So those are things that we have been working on over the past few years. Just as Nichelle said, one of those things is ensuring that families know what to say, because Alabama and Georgia are the only 2 states where individuals cannot come to their parole hearings. So we have to equip family members with what they need to ensure that their family member can be released on parole.
Great, thank you. And Doug, can you offer us a little bit of perspective here on what's happening in Georgia?
Sure. Let me try to do this right. Let's see if I can do this right. Tell me if I'm trying to share a screen. Can you see it all right?
Yes.
Good. Okay. See if I can keep it moving. That's on a different setting for me. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So most people in the criminal legal system talk about it in 3 chunks. So the front end, middle, and back end. And front end is anywhere from policing to the courts. Middle is sort of incarceration, if and when that happens, the yellow part on this chart. And the back end is everything that happens after the case is over and after someone's released from jail or prison. These numbers on the outside show Georgia's numbers. Those who are incarcerated, the first 2 numbers, 40,000 in jails, roughly about 51,000 in prison. And then the other number that's important for us, and we talk a lot about the number of people under correctional control, and that includes jail and prison and probation and parole. And then Georgia has unfortunately led the country since I know somebody started keeping these data points probably about 25 years ago, with the leader, we're the leader in the country of correctional control. We have more per capita under correctional control than any other state. And so that's about 1 in 24 Georgians, about 451,000 people. That includes probation and parole and even misdemeanor probation as well. We do a lot of work around criminal records, and that's the number there, the 4.5 million, 40% roughly of Georgia's residents have been arrested and or convicted of a crime, and that record can be seen and visible unless efforts are done to stop that. So this is just a quick, sort of setting of the stage for Georgia and where we are with numbers. And this next slide, we call it the scary slide. You're probably wondering, well, how in the world does Georgia get to be the nation's leader in correctional control? And there's a number of things I want you to notice about this slide. First is that we aren't just the leader. We are way out in front. We're the top of this chart, this bar chart. We are so far ahead of anybody and have been for so long. It's pretty bad. We call it the scary chart or the shame chart when you talk to Georgians. But significantly, I want to point out, why are we the leader? And we're the leader because of felony probation. So the dark red part of that chart, in each of the categories, of course, is probation, and most of it's felony probation. And in Georgia, we have no caps on probation, unlike our incredibly progressive neighbors like Alabama, which, like North Carolina and 35 other states, put a cap of 3 to 5 years on felony probation, not in Georgia. And the average felony probated sentence in Georgia is almost 7 years, with 40% of folks on felony probation having a 10-year sentence or more. So this is the reason that we have this huge stretch of folks who are under correctional control. And I want to point out that when you're under correctional control, when your sentence is not complete in Georgia, you can't vote. And I know that this is the League of Women Voters, and I'm sure you care deeply about this issue. So getting people off probation or off paper is a huge part of is significant and required to get people to vote. Okay, I'm going to hit a couple more data points. Again, I've already said we're the number one in correctional control. We're number 4 in incarceration. And you would think we have a crime problem in Georgia, but we don't. We're 24th with regard to crime, which makes it even more a big wondering why we are in this situation. I'm just going to pop in a few numbers here just to show you how we compare to other states in terms of our rate of incarceration. Again, this is the correctional control. I'm sorry, I think this is the probation. We're the leaders in probation, and then of course the leaders in correctional control. So this gives you a sense of how we are compared to even other states that are in the highest ranks in the country. This next slide gets a little more perspective. We love to use our friends, this group out of Massachusetts called the Prison Policy Initiative, and they put together a lot of great data. But this one just shows everybody of that 400 and some thousand people under correctional control in Georgia. Here's how it breaks down. Again, the vast majority on probation, a very small sliver on parole, and then again, small slivers, if you will, relatively on who are actually incarcerated. And I think I will stop there. I can talk more about our work, but I'll save that. And hopefully I can stop sharing and give the power back to Sarah.
Thanks so much to both of you for giving that context. And Doug, I appreciate that you broadened out our lens to see that even though tonight we're focused on prisons and on incarceration, that's certainly only one part of what really makes up a massive system of correctional control. So thank you for that. And thank you to both of you for giving us kicking that off. When we talk about, mass incarceration, the Deep South is certainly well known as having some of the highest incarceration rates and indeed rates of correctional control in the nation. How did we get here? Can some of you just help fill out the breakdown, sort of the scale of the problem, and what are some of the factors that have led us to this point? There's certainly factors including, cash bail and legal representation and other factors in the system. So Fallon, could you maybe get us started on that topic?
Sure. I'm trying to find a more polite way to maybe say what I want to say, hence my pause. But how did we get here is because this is the way the system was designed. And I know that's something that we hear a lot in various courses of, whether it's online, et cetera, in this particular time, but it is really true. So yes, someone beat me to it. So these are remnants of Jim Crow in the South. And so in the South specifically, we know that once folks weren't forced labor, they had to come up with other ways in order to continue that. And so what we're seeing now, are the remnants of vagrancy laws, of, rounding people up, in order to have forced labor. But specifically, you asked about cash bail. And so in talking about that, so cash bail, it drives high incarceration rates in Georgia and Alabama by making pretrial freedom contingent on wealth rather than safety. And so essentially you have a two-track justice system. You have folks that are pleading guilty just to get out of jail when they might not be. You have folks that are sitting and losing everything. I don't know how many folks can, miss a week, 2 weeks, a month from work and still be able to afford, their rent, their home, their cars, whatever other responsibilities they have. And so folks get caught up in the system and they can't afford to get out. And then they have lost everything by the time that they do get out, right? Which again, back to taking pleas and things of that nature when you might not actually be guilty. So we have, of course, the wealth-based detention of cash bail, the plea bargain trap, and then it also adds to this future involvement. The statistics say future involvement within the system. So the recidivism of once you get caught up in the system and it being a cyclical process, right? And so some of the other things, like in Georgia specifically, we actually had in like 2018 under Governor Deal, we had these massive like reforms on the criminal justice system, but now we are actually shifting back. And so in the last few years, Georgia has now after doing all these things of like reforming cash bail and other parts of the system, they've now implemented, it was the bill 63 that now adds 30 more offenses that actually require a cash bond. And so they're taking it out of the hands of whether it's the magistrate or whatever judge that is making case by case determinations and doing these blanket things, which is seriously impacting the problem that we've already seen in some of the numbers that Doug has presented. And so there's probably so much more I could say, but I will stop there to kind of move on to the next piece.
Great. Nichelle or Veronica, anything you want to contribute in terms of some of these factors that drive the current situation? Nichelle?
I'll let Veronica, that probably is one that she probably could answer better than I could.
Yeah, so part of the problem is, as Fallon said, the current the bail system that has been a tremendous part of the problem. Also, we focus on someone put it in the chat, the Jim Crow laws. We're most definitely fighting against the system that was not meant to protect us in the first place. And so, we oftentimes hear that, but we take it with a grain of salt, but in actuality, it is true. The representation that many people receive is oftentimes not adequate in order for them to be released back into the community. So they end up either spending an extended period of time waiting to go to trial, or once they go to trial, they don't get a fair trial, or they end up pleading out because they have sat for so long until they just want to get it over with. And so that leads to mass incarceration. And then as we delve deeper into the conversation, we'll also get more into the school to prison pipeline, which will talk more about how we get there, especially as it relates to literacy rates, because that's a contributing factor as well.
Thank you all. And that really, those answers really touch on some of the ways that in Doug's graph, that front end kind of pre-trial or pre-incarceration. But Doug, can you speak to some of the ways that sentencing laws over time have also contributed to this dynamic?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I went and found this one slide I was looking for, and I'm going to try to share again if I can do it, because this one it's a bit dated, but it's the most recent I could pull up. I mean, oh heavens, I learned how to share before, and we'll do it again. There we go. So this is another slide I use a lot. I used to use, or a version of it. Let me get through this. Can you see? Oh no, what's that? Okay. Can you see this slide, everyone? Yeah. So this is a slide, I mean, to put in perspective, I mean, I have another graph that's similar that shows incarceration rates in America being incredibly consistent per capita for over 100 years. I mean, over 100 years, like in the 18, and then something shifted in the 1980s. And so that is the big curve in the shift is really what folks talk about. Nixon having the war on drugs and the war on crime, his beginning point, and then, of course, the Sentencing Reform Act in the 80s. And in the 80s, I think it passed in 89 in the federal courts, the federal legislature. But even more specifically, the feds said, okay, we're going to do this. We can talk about how and why they did it. But then they required every state to do it. So Georgia, we did not have mandatory minimums before this. And so the feds kind of forced all the states, essentially, we're doing mandatory minimums, so should you. So the whole idea of 2 or 3 strikes and you're out laws came because of this, and around the same time. And in Georgia, they hit in the early 90s. But this is when you see this massive increase of the incarceration system, where people are incarcerated. So we can blame the feds on this, and many of you all know all this story and how it happened, or the reasons for it. But I just want to put this in perspective as well.
Thank you so much. Helpful illustration there for sure. So that's a little bit about the broader scope of how we got here and how people get caught up in this web of incarceration. And both Alabama and Georgia prison systems have certainly been under scrutiny in recent years, for longer than in recent years, but in recent years there have been investigations, and I'm sure folks on the call have seen the Alabama solution, for example, in Georgia as well. There's been a lot of media around this. So can you all talk a little bit about conditions inside prisons in the Deep South? What's happening? What are some of the realities regarding things like healthcare and safety and prison labor, the availability of rehabilitation programs? Nichelle, is that something you can speak to a little bit?
Yes, I can a little bit. So healthcare is at a minimum, especially mental health. The prison conditions are inhumane in Alabama. The prisons are overcrowded. They're sleeping on the floor. They don't have bedding to even put on the floor, so they're just sleeping on the bare floor. A lot of prisons are, feces, the bathrooms, the toilets are overflowing. In the summer, it's excessive heat. In the winter, it's very cold. It's just very inhumane, and it's not good prison conditions. And then when you're up for parole, you're being denied, and which is leading just to the prisons just staying overcrowded. I'm pretty sure everyone is aware of the $1 billion jail that is being built in Alabama, and I'm pretty sure that they're going to keep those filled to capacity. And I'll popcorn to Veronica and let her finish, I guess, any thoughts in regards to it.
Yeah, so back in 2019, the Department of Justice, and it may have been earlier than that, the Department of Justice came in and they did a study, and they determined that Alabama had the most dangerous prisons in the country. Our murder rate was amongst the highest. We had a high drug rate, and as well as a high suicide rate. As a result of the high suicide rate, and I mean, as a result of the high murder rate and the conditions of Alabama prisons, one of the things that the Department of Justice suggested was that they go in and make some changes to the prisons that were currently standing in the state of Alabama. So go in, put in some various cameras, change the way the doors are set up. Most prisons now have pod type systems. And so those are the suggestions that they made. Our governor, who is our current governor, she deemed that it would be necessary to build 4 new prisons in order to comply with this Department of Justice mandate. So she wanted to build 4 new prisons, and she wanted to privatize these prisons, and she wanted Core Civic to run these prisons. And there would be a 30-year lease agreement, right? So at the end of 30 years, the state of Alabama still would not own those prisons. They still would have to go back and buy those prisons from Core Civic. Now, this is also around the time Core Civic decided to rebrand themselves, and also around the time that the federal government stopped using Core Civic. So as the federal government stopped using Core Civic, the state of Alabama said, "Oh, I got a good idea. We'll go in and we'll start using Core Civic." And that's what they wanted to do. My organization, along with SPLC, ACLU, and other grassroots and grasstops organizations, we formed a coalition called Communities Not Prisons. As a result of Communities Not Prisons, as well as some decarceration people that we met from upstate New York, we band together and we stopped them from building those 4 new prisons. So what many people don't realize is that the state of Alabama was supposed to have 4 new prisons built. But as a result of our grassroots efforts and our grassroots organizing, we were able to stop the state of Alabama from building 4 prisons here in the state. Not only that, when they came around the second time and they began to build prisons, if y'all have noticed, we have 1 prison being built, but when it came around the second time for their prisons being built, they did not meet their bond deal. That's because we were still on their necks, for lack of a better term. I can't think of no other way to say it. We were still on their necks. And so because we had somebody that knew the bond market and the way municipal bonds work, so I'm a political science major. My degree is in political science, criminal justice. I can read, I can write. Adding and subtracting is not my thing. But we had somebody who specialized in financing, and they were able to look at the bond market, tell us when those bonds were going to market, and tell us who we needed to go after in order to stop those bonds from making. And from my understanding, municipal bonds almost always do what they're supposed to do, because it's going to be a return on their investment. And so the municipal bonds did not make it where they were supposed to make it. So as a result, we only have one prison being built. Still not happy about that one prison, but one prison is better than four, because in recent headlines, what we learned is, well, they initially told us, well, once we build this new 4,000 bed mega prison, we're going to close some of the other smaller dilapidated facilities and have this one facility. Now that's not going to happen. So that's kind of where we are. Our murder rate is still the same. We're still understaffed. People are still not being let out on parole. And if you ever heard the saying, if you build it, they will come. Alabama is literally building prisons and in an attempt to fill them up for them to pay for themselves.
Thank you.
And I just want to note quickly that I know this is all about, prisons and kind of like the parole side, but the same conditions that are happening in prisons and the same atrocities and inhumane things, they're also happening in the jails, right? And the jails are, typically, at least in Georgia, run by the counties versus the state. But they are using like these bad data and these bad reasonings for doing the things and for jails and prisons and using them interchangeably. And there's a lot of these same players. So for instance, like in the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta, it's inhumane. People are sleeping on the floor. People are being murdered. They have drug problems. People unfortunately have died from, bed bug infestations. They're not getting mental health treatment. So the DOJ has also came in and said, Fulton County, you need to fix these things. And instead they're like, oh, we need a new $2 billion jail, right? And we want 4,000 beds. Like there's this connection to all of these things and all of these players. And they're like learning really bad policies and ideas from each other. Sometimes it feels like we're yelling into the void with all of the data and information to like show the way that we need to go. Multiple reports on, hey, if you do these things, you'll actually reduce the jail population. You reduce jail populations, guess what? You also reduce prison populations, right? So all of this stuff is like interconnected. And so I just wanted to note that. I'm sorry, Sarah.
No, thank you for that. That's perfect. And I'm glad that you brought jails into the picture, because one of the things that's different about jails is the vast majority of people are there pre-trial, prior to have been convicted of anything, and still subject to the kinds of conditions that you're mentioning. And so many more people cycle in and out of jails in any given year than do our prisons. So it's an important issue that you brought up. Well, part of our discussion tonight is really honing in on prison labor. And so I thought it might be important for us to kind of set the stage for what's happening in these states around the use of prison labor. Fallon, since we just had you on, can you talk a little? I know that's within your wheelhouse. Can you talk a little bit about that in Georgia?
Prison labor, not so much. I don't have as much expertise on prison labor. I can talk about the points of how like prison towns and that aspect of it, but I'm not sure.
Sure. Any ways that prisons are interacting with the economy would be great.
Okay, sorry.
No,
So I think one of the big things that especially happens in rural areas is we say that like ending prison labor or closing the facilities is going to have significant impacts on the community. And so we're like, well, we can't close the prison because whatever source of like funding for the community, whether it's folks that are working in the prison themselves or the labor, it's going the community around it is going to collapse. And so, but what we're missing in that is this idea of like pivoting to sustainable economic alternatives, whether that's green energy, tourism, infrastructure reinvestment, essentially like thinking more outside the box. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to like the research and the data, it shows that prisons rarely provide long-term economic salvation to these towns. And so they actually, they take away from them. And then like it just becomes this cycle where, the towns essentially die. You also have the prison gerrymandering issue of where when it comes to representation, in the legislature, they're counting prison populations, at least in Georgia. And so you have folks that have disproportionate, like essentially influence because of these prisons in their district. So there, I would say we would encourage, but also, so we encourage the actual counties, cities that not own, that these prisons are located to think outside the box. But there's also things that we can do on the state level. Like there's state level policies that if we would actually invest in people, that could have a significant impact, whether that's things like baby bonds and how that can impact folks' opportunities, when they're children, when they're graduating from high school, and now they have more opportunities and choices because now you have $18,000 to decide, what you do, whether that's putting forth policies like guaranteed basic income. And I think what happens is we, things have shifted so far in one direction that like we've lost sight of even where maybe center is. And because of that, it's like we're almost not dreaming anymore. And we're just like, there's no way these policies will pass because we're like, oh, we don't have the representation in the state house. But it's like when we just seed that narrative and we don't, push back on like what we actually can have and what we actually want, then this is like, that's what we're left with. And so I hope that answers the question. But yeah, my thought is like, there's so many things, especially like green energy and like wind farms. And so like, there's so many options and things that we could do to like really advance areas instead of just relying on the things that we always relied on. And I know this is going to sound a little off, but I think one of the things that COVID showed us, especially as the criminal justice system, is that we could be more imaginative and we didn't have to do the things the same way that we had been doing them for 20 plus years. There were, during COVID, folks did start getting more access. There was, Zoom court and other things. And so there was these things that showed us that we can do things differently and have better outcomes. And so I want us to kind of like, even when it comes to whether it's prison labor and all these things, like take those type of learnings and like move forward. But I think that starts with us not just giving up the narrative and like saying, no, these are the things we want and like, and demanding them, even if we know they're not going to get passed this year. So for another example, my organization, one of our legislative priorities for long term is to end state preemption on rent control in Georgia, right? And so we know that's not going to pass this cycle, right? But if we don't ever talk about it, it's never going to pass. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Fallon. And before I move over to the Alabama perspective on this, Doug, anything you'd like to add as it relates to that intersection between prisons and labor?
Well, it's a big topic. Okay. Well, first of all, prisons. This is true for everywhere. They're built where the land is cheap, where the dirt is cheap. They don't build prisons where there's a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people generally, the land is more expensive. So what you end up doing, back to the connection, of course, that Fallon made, but this between the local economy is that there's often nothing else there except agriculture in Georgia. Even in Georgia, most of the prisons are in middle and South Georgia. They aren't even in North Georgia, where it's harder, because of the mountains and the hills. They're in the South. So a couple of things. One, that really impacts the opportunities for rehabilitation. We've seen it with our clients, and part of what we do, we do a bunch of things here, but we defend people. We're like a private public defender on one side of our work, but we follow our clients into prison and afterwards. So reentry, since we started 40 years ago, has always been part of our work on an individual basis. And I've been to about every prison in Georgia numerous times, and I'll never forget seeing one of our guys down in way South Georgia, Southwest Georgia, and he went into prison illiterate, And we hoped that he would, we wrote letters and hoped that they would line him up with a counselor or somebody to help. And it turns out he was sent to this prison was so far away from everything that there was one volunteer who came like once a month. And it was like, because it was like an hour from the next closest town of any size. And I've talked to people in the technical college system in Georgia as well, even when they want to bring classes inside the prison system, but often they're so far away that it's hard to. So this distance creates a number of barriers and it creates a number of problems, both in terms of rehabilitation. In terms of labor, I mean, one of the things we know is that in Georgia, nobody's paid for the labor they do, but working a detail, as they call it, is required. You can get a DR or disciplinary report for not willing to go to work. The way I understood this, and I haven't looked at this for a few years, but a number of years ago, we looked at this. There's some data on this and said that in Georgia, the actual cost. So let me say one quick story to make this sense. This is one of our other guys on a prison near Milledgeville, in the middle part of the state, and he was so excited that he was doing woodworking, and that was his job, and he was excited because now he was working. He got promoted to working on judges' chairs. And of course, I just thought the irony of all this, like this guy's in prison for, he had probably a life sentence. He's gotten out since, but he's working on chairs for the people who sent him to prison. That's a trip. But on top of that so the way often it works inside the system is that the system isn't selling stuff to the outside market. It's selling stuff to other agencies inside the system. So now the court system or the school system or any system doesn't have to pay outside vendors. They actually, it's just a paper transfer inside the state of Georgia. And understanding that I read a data point years ago that said that the actual prison system in Georgia didn't cost them anything. I mean, on books, it's like $1 billion, $1.2 billion, $1.3 billion, $1.4 billion. But when you look at the transfers, what the state didn't have to pay for chairs and food and building schools was actually a net savings. So that's the other. So the economy gets very complicated, and you don't have to throw in the private sector, which doesn't really hit Georgia. You can just look at the public sector and see how complicated it is, and see how the financial incentives and the financial connectivity, if you will. So let me stop there. But I saw somebody ask a question about the gerrymandering point. I'm glad Fallon made that point. Actually, it's a federal law in Georgia. It's a federal law that says you can count for census purposes. I believe this is right because in other words, if a prison's in somebody's district, the feds count it. This is the census rules as that's the population for that county. And local legislators, when they talk about taking a prison away, this happened a few years ago in Georgia, and a third of the population of that county was folks in prison, and they knew that that they would get less dollars from the way all these allocations work. So this issue of the counting the heads, but not for money for people who aren't in prison is another interesting way and sad way this plays out.
Yeah, it's all interconnected. It reminds me of starting my job here at UGA and opening up my file cabinet, and there was a slip in there that told me that my file cabinet was made by prisoners in one of the state prisons. I don't remember which, but I remember thinking, okay, that's one way to start. Let's turn to Alabama then, the perspective on these dynamics that we've been discussing. Veronica, what are you all seeing in Alabama around prisons and labor?
So pretty much the same thing as it relates to prison and labor. So we have a lot of people who are in what you call work release, or so we have several work release facilities here in the state of Alabama. So in those work release facilities, they are contracted out to perform labor at certain companies. I don't know the names of the companies, but they're contracted out to perform labor at certain companies. Well, of course, because they're on work release, they have to pay for their transportation, and they have to give another large portion of their checks to the state. So the state is keeping the majority of the money that they're making, and not to mention that the company that they're contracted to is also paying the state for these laborers. So the state is making like a goo-gobble money. And y'all excuse my language. Sometimes I just use everyday terminology in talking, but they're making tons of money from these people. And so another problem that we have, and Michelle could probably go into more detail about this, is when these same individuals, now keep in mind, these individuals may have been convicted of violent offenses. And these individuals are working within the community. So they're working in the community. They may be at a local restaurant. They may be at a local veterinary facility. And so they're at the facilities during the day and they're working with everyday individuals. However, when it's time for them to come up for parole, they're denied parole. And I've had that situation to happen personally on a parole case that I was working, where a guy, not only was he in a work release facility and working in the community, he was also on furlough. So that meant that every other weekend he would go home. And so he's working, he's in work release, and every other weekend he's going home. And when it was time for him to be paroled, they denied him parole the first time and set him off a year. So those are the type of things that we are dealing with, and Michelle probably can go into more specifics or more details about those conditions or situations.
Yes, to piggyback off of Veronica, so in Alabama, it's the rate for a low risk person, and that's a person who's probably in work release. They are denying them, they're denying them at a higher rate than what they would of a moderate risk person. And so, like, if we look at the numbers in fiscal year 23, they only allowed 31% of incarcerated in low risk, which are in work release, to be released versus 42% in a moderate. And so it's like, what is going on? And so you can only equate that it's a money grab, because as she stated, you're allowing them to leave out of the jails and work. You're saying that they're suitable enough to work in society. You're giving them furloughs, meaning that they can go home for 24, 48 to 72 hours at home with their family, and they're voluntarily bringing themselves back into the prisons and not having any issues. But then when they come up for parole, you're not allowing them to parole out. So we can only take that it's about the money, the money that they're making off of them. And then as far as what's the word I'm looking for? Using prison labor. If you look at our state house, majority of the furniture in the state house is made from prisoners or the incarcerated. The same that goes into the parole board. Much of the furniture that you see in our parole rooms, the hearing rooms are in that building. Majority of that furniture is made from the incarcerated. So it's free. I mean, like, they're getting free labor in exchange for product. So,
and I'll turn this question to any of our panelists that would like to respond. But it's clear that there are benefits for the state in terms of the use of prison labor, and potentially to local communities having prison building happening. Are there any programs in either state that seems beneficial to prisoners themselves, people who are incarcerated, in terms of building skills or rehabilitation? Or would you all argue that this is really purely more exploitative?
It's not enough. It's not enough. And what I find when I'm going to parole hearings, typically, the board may ask family members about certain things and they don't have the certification. And the reason that they don't have the certification is because it's a wait list for this program that they need in order to parole out. Therefore, when they come up for parole, it's showing like they just are not taking the class, but they've been waitlisted. So there's a lack of rehabilitative programs in the state of Alabama. There are not any programs, to me, like when I go into parole hearings for the men, they offer them Prep Academy, which is a 90-day program to help them transition into the free world, from being incarcerated. But women are not afforded the same thing as the men. So the women don't have the same options as the men do, like for that programs. So it's a lack of in Alabama, I would say, as far as halfway houses, rehabilitative programs. There's a lack of NA, AA programs. And so it affects the parole rate in Alabama.
Well, I could jump in here. I mean, you know, Michelle, the same thing. We've seen a lot of our guys can't get into programs, or if you have a life sentence or your sentence is too far out, they delay you because somebody's coming up for parole sooner or going to be out sooner, and they want to reserve those spots for somebody they think it can have a bigger impact on because they're going to be out sooner. But then it becomes a catch-22 because you didn't take the class, so you don't get queued up for parole. Anyway, that's a catch-22. But I would say we actually work at a prison. There's only one prison inside the perimeter, the Atlanta Beltway, so to speak, here in Atlanta. The only prison inside the Beltway or the perimeter was an abandoned prison until 8 years ago, and it got repurposed called the Metro Reentry Facility. And this facility, the Department of Corrections, I'm going to sound like an apologist for the Department of Corrections. I mean, because this is a really interesting prison, and we're out there every week, by the way, I should say. So this prison is all focused on a number of things. So they've designed a prison, and it's not a halfway house. They have a number of transition centers, I call them, in Georgia. But it is a prison for a 2-year course of both therapeutic and job skills issues for people who are from Atlanta, who are coming back to Atlanta. Also, the prison system doesn't usually do that because prisons are far-flung around the state. It focuses on getting folks ready to come back home, which most prison systems don't usually do that a lot. I mean, even say reentry in a prison is not, or even to have that even in the title is unusual. And also this prison, as many of us know, as hard as it is to get out of prison, sometimes it's equally hard to get in as a volunteer or bring in some services. And this prison is they have a staff, they keep waving groups in. In fact, we got kind of queued up with them before they opened, and they asked us to get involved. And we're out there doing two things primarily. Legally, one of our social workers is involved there too. And we work with, actually last calendar year, we work with, of the 350 guys, it's all male, who are going through there on any given year, roughly. We work with about 282 of them. They've done, the Department of Corrections has done their own recent study about the recidivism rates for folks who go through MRF, we call it, Metro Reentry Facility, which they found it significantly lower than other, the regular prison folks getting out. But here's a couple more things about it to make it interesting. They have targeted sort of high-risk folks. So they're not creaming. They're not going in and saying, we're looking at people who are not likely to come back. They actually said, we want this to be used for people who are likely to come back statistically based on whatever data points they're using. And so they've gone after young guys, a lot of, young guys, violent offenders, gang related. There's a number of nonprofits and groups like ours who are there doing a number of things, intervening. So that is very encouraging. And it's also encouraging. The Department of Corrections has said they're trying to sort of export that around the state system because they want this to start showing up inside various prisons. So, I mean, that's one encouraging thing I see happening. And in fact, when my team goes out there, especially some of my lawyers who are former public defenders, and they leave and they come back and they say, I'm not supposed to like a prison. I'm just not supposed to but I like that place. It's just, it's unusual. One more point I'll make is they actually do not call the residents inmates. It's actually the former warden used to charge $1 for staff who use that word. They call them returning citizens, just to show you sort of a different mentality. They don't they don't want their guards to be called guards. They're counselors, and which they are. They're all to a higher level sort of education or ranking, however they get there. So they're really trying to change the way that part of the system works. At least see if it can work well. And I think so far they're finding good results.
And I just want to say, fun fact, well, I guess not fun fact, but years ago, at a different organization I worked for, we were actually in there at the same time as Georgia Justice Project. And so they were helping make sure that folks didn't have holds on them at that time, so that when they got out, they actually, when their sentence ended, they weren't then picked up for somewhere else, which was really awesome. And then my organization at that time was like helping to make sure people had identification, because just having IDs was like an important aspect that like folks don't realize. And then the cost of like getting out of state birth certificates and various things and like going through all of that to actually make sure that you have identification, because you can't get into, you know, programs and facilities and other things without proper identification. So I would have to kind of second Doug on the being a facility that was like, oh, if this is going to be like, this is, if we have to have them, like this is, you know, something that perhaps should be a model. And I don't think it gets talked about enough, like what they're doing over there.
Fallon, were you with the Real ID group? What do they call them? The ID?
Yes, yeah, Real ID, spread the vote. Yep.
Yeah, we had loved working with you guys. That was great.
And I agree. It's great to hear that there is potentially a promising direction going on with Metro. Well, a few minutes ago, we brought up the topic of the parole board and some of the ways that parole board decisions can play into these dynamics. Nichelle, I know you spend a lot of time observing parole hearings. Can you tell us a little bit about what goes on in that room in Alabama?
Sure. So in Alabama, the incarcerated person cannot speak at their parole hearing, so they solely depend on their support. And again, their support could consist of family, friends, community, church advocates, sometimes halfway houses. They depend solely on them. You can only have two people speak on your behalf unless you have an attorney. An attorney can speak and then two other people can speak. They only have 2 minutes to speak. And so what I was finding as I go to parole hearings is that in the 2 minutes, it goes by fast. Your loved one is nervous and they're not hitting the key factors that they need to hit in order to get a grant. And the key factors that I'm referring to is, are you offering us a successful reentry plan? What is your loved one going to do? What changes have you noticed since them being incarcerated? When they come home, who's going to take care of them financially? Who's going to be their transportation? Because typically when they come out into the free world, they don't have a driver's license. So they need someone to get them to point A to point B. And the point A to point B, what are they going to be, where are they going to be working? Do you have employment lined up for them? Are they going into a halfway house? Who's going to pay for their bed at the halfway house? Typically, if the state of Alabama grants you parole, you will have additional conditions. And typically, the additional conditions could consist of having a GPS monitor. Who's going to pay your monitoring fees? So these are the issues that need to be addressed when they're going in front of the board that they typically don't address. They just say, I miss my loved one, I'm ready for them to come home. And that's not what the board is looking for. On top of the poor testimony that they're given, they then have to face the opposition. And so when you're going into opposition, you're looking at facing the AG office, the victims or the victim's family. Vocal is a nonprofit group that speaks on the behalf of the victim's family, and Vocal stands for Victims of Crime and Leniency. And then you don't even know if you're going to be facing the local district attorney office or the local law enforcement to come speak on that behalf. So then you look at all of that is stacked up. They're going to hold you to your 2 minutes, but they're going to allow them to go over their 2 minutes. And then the biggest kicker that I see of it all is that 9 times out of 10, the incarcerated person has a disciplinary infraction or disciplinary infractions that the support side either do not know about or they do not address it in front of the board. And then when the opposition gets up in front of the board, they'll say, inmate such and such has 39 disciplinary infractions, 5 within last year, and it leads to a denial. So these are some of the factors that we face in the state of Alabama, and that is why I came up with the initiative of Atoning Alabama to teach the citizens of Alabama what they have to look forward to as they go into the room, because they're clueless and they don't know. And then in the state of Alabama, if you're denied, they have to give you a set-off date. And the set-off date, the maximum set-off date is 5 years. So that leads to you being in prison for 5 more years to come up for parole again. So I hope that answered your question.
Oh, definitely. And Veronica, I'm just wondering if there's anything you'd like to add about how this system works in the Alabama context.
Yeah, so pretty much everything Nichelle just said, and one of the things that I would like to piggyback on or to talk about is the opposition. So, like she said, vocal, for whatever reason, vocal is always there. Even when the family doesn't necessarily want vocal to be there, vocal is going to be there. So vocal is going to be there, and they're going to give their tad bit, and they're going to basically, when they're talking, when the attorney general's office is talking, they're going to replay these crimes all over again. Like, I literally, no joke, it was a murder parole, y'all. It was bad. And so the guy's brother came, but what I didn't realize is his brother wasn't born when he was killed. His brother spoke at the parole hearing. He fell out at the parole hearing and everything. And so I'm looking like, what's going on? So when after the parole hearing, the mom of the guy that I was with, she was like, yeah, he wasn't born until about 10 years afterwards. And I was like, okay, wow. So those are the type of things that we have to deal with inside parole hearings. So again, let me go back to something that I said earlier. Alabama and Georgia are the only 2 states in the country that don't allow individuals to come to their parole hearings. Alabama and Georgia. So what we're trying to do in Georgia, I'm sorry, I'm in Alabama all day. What we're trying to do in Alabama is we're trying to pass a virtual presence bill. So with this virtual presence bill, what they'll be able to do is at least be able to appear virtually for their parole hearings, right? So this is something that they hadn't done before. So even with us being on them about the virtual presence bill, what we have at least been able to do within the last year, starting July of 2025, now they can at least play a recorded statement, because at one point they couldn't even play a recorded statement. We heard nothing from the person. They could do nothing to advocate on their own behalf. Absolutely, positively nothing. Any advocating had to be done by somebody else. So now we can get at least a recorded statement played. Our hope or our prayer or our ultimate goal this legislative session is to actually get this virtual presence bill across the finish line. And so we had to push it in such a way that made it be beneficial for both the defendant's family and for the victim's family, because now the victim's family, they no longer have to come to these parole hearings. They can appear virtually as well as the defendant. So now we have everybody at the parole hearing and they're virtually, so they don't have to stand before their accuser anymore. So again, Alabama and Georgia, the only 2 states in the country, the only 2 states, 50 states, Alabama and Georgia, the only 2 where our individuals cannot go to their parole hearing. Somebody said, what can we do? And I know it's not time for questions yet, but let me just bounce this, Dr. Shannon. Contact your legislators. Contact your senators, right? Because they are literally, we are in session right now. People in Alabama, we got a bill right now, SB 240. It will go on the Senate floor within the next couple of weeks. Push for that bill. We need virtual presence. We need these people to at least be able to advocate for themselves. I'm a tax-paying citizen. They can make a lot more money in the community than they can behind the wall. So I would much rather them be in the community contributing to society versus being behind the wall where we're having to continue to take care of them. So SB 240.
And Dr. Shannon, I forgot to also tell everyone, and the other factor that the opposition has over the support side is that the AG office typically has access to that person's file. Your family is going in blind. They don't have the same information that the opposition has, and so that plays a factor as well.
Thank you. What about in Georgia, Doug? Is, similar setup, but are you seeing similar dynamics? Is GJP aware of any of that?
It's a lot worse in Georgia on that front. I mean, I've had clients that have parole revocations and asked for hearings, and I can't even. There is no. The hearing happens. There isn't even a right to. It's actually done around a table on the parole board. So there. I mean, there. I've been at this a long time. I think there's one time we've actually had a real hearing, and it was like 30 years ago. I mean, even when I, yeah. So let me just say this. So the parole system at Georgia. Um, there's been a lot of articles in the last year, in particular in the Atlanta papers, I think, about the lack of transparency, about how, I mean, when I say transparency, most of the sort of advocates and families and people talk are really thinking about, well, why was I denied, or why was my family member denied? And we want to know, what they're really thinking or what they really want. But the reality is, this is, Veronica's talking about in Alabama, you don't even know, there's not even a process you can see, much less to know what is valued. Now, having said that, I mean, we actually, for our clients, we work with the parole board in a number of ways. One way is with parole, getting people out. But the other way is with pardons, which is separate, all done by the same pardon and parole board, which is a series of 5 people appointed by the governor for about 5-year terms, I think. And right now, actually, the parole board chair is a former DA from Cobb County, the first African American woman DA in Cobb County, who's a wonderful person, Juliette Holmes. And we work with her to set up the first expungement desk inside Cobb County, first expungement desk for Georgia that we operate with the county up there and the prosecutors. And so you probably know we operate a similar desk in Athens, an expungement desk in Athens. I don't know if you know that since you're up there. But anyway, we do one in Augusta as well. But the point is she's a forward thinker. She's, and I think there's probably going to come a time, God willing, when the parole board and the legislature decide to pull, and I think there's bills are often layered in there, but they don't really get anywhere to sort of pull back the curtain from the parole board. That being said, so I don't want to. There's no illusions that I have any sense of what's really going on. I mean, because you just have to. It's like you got to kind of guess about, especially on the getting somebody out on the parole side. Having said that, much as like Nicole said, we have you can sort of predict. I mean, there's a way of approaching parole, which a number of folks around the country, you've learned enough if you hang out in this space about what they care about. And I always say we put our parole packages in 3 buckets. Who was the person before they went to prison, and or are there any circumstances related to their case? Whether it's mental health, whether it's innocence, whatever it might be, or involvement, regardless of the verdict. The second part is what have they done in prison, and that includes DRs, but also includes rehabilitation and all that. And then the last part that is often missed by, I've seen packets by paid lawyers being paid lots of money from all over the country for Georgia people who miss this. The very point that you made, Michelle, is that they don't talk about what's the plan when they get out. And the parole board, if you don't talk about that, then they want to know. You got to know. You've got to have a plan. So I'm not saying that we're experts at it. We do a lot of this work. I also know that there's a group in Alabama called Redemption Earned that's been around for a few years, started by the former Chief Justice, I think, of the Alabama Supreme Court. And there's a group in Georgia that's sort of taken that model and started. They just got their 501c3 status a few weeks ago. Some friends of mine have started that. Mainly because of their work at a women's prison here in the state. But having said all that, so let me. I feel like I want to just put one more thing in context, and I didn't mention this. I mean, parole. If we're talking about parole, the whole point is getting out of prison, right? That's the point. I don't. Hopefully, you all know this, but we passed a law in partnership with a number of partners this past year, mainly domestic violence partners, around resentencing. And this has been something that only 6 states in the country have done. So if you're trying to get out of prison, there's only a couple of ways to get out. Either you get paroled out and all the things we're talking about, you have a habeas, or you go straight from the I shouldn't be here argument, which is those are time limited and very low success rates. So around the country, there's been a movement to sort of create an opportunity to get people out of prison under resentencing. And that branches a couple different ways. And we have this very aggressive law. We passed HB 582. It's probably the most aggressive law in the country as it relates to 2 different paths on getting out of prison. One for folks who can show the correlation between their abuse, particularly domestic violence survivors, and their crime, but also for folks who like is the best interest of society. And that's really for prosecutor initiated resentencing, which we've done a few of those cases around the state. And this is where I'm encouraged. I think the more doors you open to get people out of prison, I mean, that's really what you have to do, because the parole boards, until we change the laws dramatically, are really occluded from understanding, and I'm going to say this too, even if we could see what's going on, even if we had all the access, it doesn't mean they're going to change their opinion. It doesn't mean they're going to change their stance. So I'm not against transparency, but I'm saying, look, we've got to create more mechanisms to get out. So in Georgia, for instance, there are more and more elected officials, prosecutors primarily, and judges who are interested in doing something different. There was this article in the AJC yesterday about, Georgia has more African-American women prosecutors than like any other state in the country. I think it was like, and we work with most of those folks who are my friends. I was on a call with two of them today. But the point is that those guys are looking for ways to do things differently. They initiated resentencing on their own. We were doing a restorative justice effort on the front end of cases with three different DAs around the state. So I think there's an opportunity to think beyond parole, because parole is as already been said, is very tight. It's very occluded, and it is mainly the only way out until this law passed last year and went into effect on July 1st. Let me stop there. I just want to make sure I mention that bill. And we call it Survivor Justice Act, SJA. You can Google it and pull it up. It's on the materials. I think it will be sent out from this event.
That's great. Thank you. Fallon, I know we haven't heard from you in a while. And, as Doug just said, the point is, when we're thinking about parole or maybe some of these other mechanisms, getting out of prison. So can you speak to maybe some of the barriers that people face in the reentry process, and some of the different ways that maybe can be used to try to overcome some of those?
Yeah, so first I want to kind of note it was a little bit inspired by what Denise, I think that says Denise just said in the chat. So until we change the overall framing of like people go to prison for punishment versus rehabilitation, like the framing is always going to be like people aren't deserving of. And so there's this idea that whatever harms that you face in jail or prison are part of your sentence. And so you might have you were sentenced for 5 years, but you were attacked while you're inside. Well, that is part of your punishment for said bad choice. But regardless of what the bad choice was, I think that like we forget that, like, I know if I was even judged on my worst day in life, that I don't know where I would be, right? So this idea that we don't think, and I'm saying we liberally, right? But we don't believe people are deserving of a second chance or rehabilitation is where it starts off being wrong. And so then when folks face the barriers, upon release, there are crime-free housing ordinances, right? Restricting where people can live. I mentioned briefly about just having identification and proper identification and being able to get that to access resources. Some places have started to do ban the box, but a lot of times it's something good. They say they're doing ban the box, but then they're really still checking stuff. When it comes to expungement, like in Georgia, expungement isn't always true expungement. It's still showing up in certain places for certain things. And so like records are still there. So then, you're denied access. We know that there's lack of access to, like federal benefits and stuff, a lot of times because of convictions. And so when you don't allow people to meet their most basic needs, people are people and people are desperate. And so it's like we trap people from being able to meet their most basic needs. And so there are a few things that were happening in the Georgia legislature, like making, marijuana convictions not be barriers to certain there's certain resources like, grants and Pell Grants and scholarships and other things like that that were like moving through the legislature where it was like moving in the right direction. But also, on a personal note, I find it problematic. A lot of times we try to separate out, lower level offenses, non-violent offenders, to be like, oh, well, they're not deserving. I mean, well, they are deserving of a second chance. But I do think, that's back to changing the mindset. Sometimes people that have committed violent crimes are also deserving of rehabilitation and a second chance. But because of the way sometimes we separate them out, it's like, oh, if you did misdemeanors or stuff, you shouldn't have to pay these harsh penalties. But in doing so, we're saying that those things that are happening to folks that committed more violent quote unquote crimes are deserving of these awful atrocities that are happening to them. But then some of the other good things, there's organizations there's an organization in Georgia called Barred Business, and they're working on a protective class initiative. And so they have worked with the city of Atlanta and other organizations to have your criminal history, your criminal record be included in the protected class in the code of City of Atlanta. So, race, religion, gender, those things, and now your criminal history is included. And they are working to expand that into other places. I think like Augusta and other places to try to break down some of those barriers that folks are facing. But yeah, so like folks need all of the things when they're coming out in order to be successful. And then we haven't, and we've kind of touched on it, I think, here and there in other answers, but jails, so therefore prisons, are some of the biggest providers of not some of the biggest providers of mental health services, right? And so when you think about the percentage of folks that have mental health issues that are remaining untreated in prison because of the lack of, not having enough staff, et cetera. And then we're, putting folks back out with that have not been healed. And that, like kind of creates this cycle, not kind of, it does create this cycle.
Thanks, Fallon. Any of our other panelists want to add anything to that about the reentry process and some of the challenges people face? I know there's a lot to say. Doug.
Yeah.
Or Michelle, go ahead.
Like I stated earlier, it's just the lack of rehabilitative programs. There are a lack of halfway houses. It's just not enough halfway houses to accommodate those who are probably coming up for parole, for them to get a bed to be able to even present in front of the board. So I really don't know how to fix this problem, but it's just the lack of services that are offered to them. And I think someone asked the question in the chat about special programming. If they're not getting the programming on the inside, I think the only thing that I know that Alabama has right now is either Prep Academy. And again, I reiterate, this is only for the men. You have Prep Academy, and then I think it's waiting list for the NAs and the AAs, but I think that they are afforded that. I think you have a program called MOD, it's MOUD. And the crazy thing about that is that I've literally watched someone come up in front of the parole board and said that my son completed the MOD program, and the board was completely clueless as to what that was. They denied that person. We were on a golf cart going back to our cars, and they had to call them back into the parole room, where they eventually granted that person parole after they did their research, their due diligence. And that program has to do something with substance abuse, I guess, like where you have to be weaned off of a certain type of drug. And so in their release, they are afforded like whatever this drug is that helps them wean off. They're allotted that amount of drugs once they're released. The board did not have any clue about that program, and that person who was incarcerated and their parents eventually came to the Joint Prison Committee meeting held in Alabama and spoke about that. So, you know, I just think it's just a disconnect between ADOC, which is the Alabama Department of Corrections, the Oversight Committee. There's a lack of oversight over ADOC, and it's a disconnect about the rehabilitative programs that they have, which they tried to discuss in our last Joint Prison Committee meeting, and it still was not completely addressed. So,
well, let me jump in just for a minute because we, as an organization, we've been committed to reentry for our folks we serve and we represent, and so much so that in the early '90s we saw so many of our guys coming out of prison. We did great inside. I mean, they took advantage of every program, and they get out, couldn't find a job. We were so frustrated that we started our own landscape company. We ran it for 17 years, and we called it New Horizon Landscaping. And it created jobs. It really meant to be short term or not terribly long term, but at its height before the Great Recession, which kind of did the landscape industry in, at least in Atlanta around here, we would employ maybe 40 guys a year, which was a huge number of people. So for us, we have there's a number of barriers. But the biggest barrier is having a criminal record. I mean, it just is. I mean, it affects everything. And that's why we pivoted really, particularly in the early 2000s, to sort of focus on these 4.5 million people in Georgia who have a record. And, Fallon's right. We deal, last year alone, we represented about 2,000 people in about 80 or 90 counties in Georgia of the 159 counties. We do expungement events all around the state with a number of partners. And we see the sad part is that the national number is, even when a state has a decent law for getting something off your record, only 6 to 7% of people take advantage of that law because the law requires you to file something more often than not. If you don't have clean slate legislation, then what you have to do is, like in Georgia, you've got to find us, or you've got to file something on your own, or you've got to do something to get something off your record. A handful of states have been moving to have what's called clean slate, that after a certain period of time, some things just roll off your record. Pennsylvania, Utah, Maryland, California, I think. The point is that that we see that having a record is one of the biggest barriers. So, and we are very proactive about what we do. So we are encouraged that the governor gave a bunch of money to the court system to change the computer system. They call the CMS system that the courts communicate with the jails and the cops and the prisons. And they have been working on this and rolled it out just last month. And when it was announced, we've been at the table with some of that because we wanted to make sure that new system could do a few things, including which, if you cleared one part of somebody's record, you could clear the whole thing. That the Department of the state police, which is GCIC in Georgia, the Crime Information Center is under them, that if you went to the courthouse and tried to clear your record, basically in Georgia, you have two different steps. So the point that Fallon made is you have to do two things if you want to clear your record. You have to go to the GBI and you have to go to the court. And so if we have a unified system, which this new computer system has the promise of delivering for Georgia, then we might be on the cusp of moving to having the possibility of having clean slate legislation, which what that significantly means is that the extent the law applies to somebody's record, the extent that applies, so it could come off the record, they wouldn't have to do anything. And so now the 94% of people who have a record for which a relief is available won't have to do anything. And that's the beauty of clean slate. So I'm encouraged that we're on the edge of this possibly happening in Georgia with this new system rolling out. So that's one positive thing, because we spend a lot of our time on the issue of criminal records.
Great. Well, I'm glad you pivoted us towards some promising reforms, Doug. So I'm wondering if our other panelists could also let us know what they think are some of the most promising reforms either happening or on the horizon. So Veronica, can you speak to some of those things happening in Alabama?
So actually, Nichelle just dropped a couple of programs that they're doing in the chat because somebody had asked the question. So I think Nichelle would probably be better suited to answer that question.
Perfect. Thanks, Nichelle.
So I did just drop in the chat, as I stated, again, the program that I was telling you that the board was totally clueless about. So the MOD program for the women, they do have a 6-month crime bill program that is offered at Tutwiler, and they also are offering the MOD program to the women too, as well. Can you hear me? Because I'm showing that I'm unstable. Okay. They're also offering them the MOD program as well. I think out of all of the facilities, I think the MOD program is being offered at 12 facilities that are in ADOC, which is the Alabama Department of Correction. And then you have the Prep Academy. And again, the Prep Academy is offered to those who are incarcerated, but only the parole board can offer them the Prep Academy. Otherwise, you would have to search for a halfway house who's offering a bed, who will be willing to take your loved one in.
And I think there's a question here just clarifying, what is the MOD program that you're referring to?
The MOD program is medication for opioid use disorder.
Okay, great. Thank you. Fallon, any most promising reforms that you see happening in Georgia?
So I know it was mentioned about the school to prison pipeline at the beginning, and we didn't really have a chance to get into it. But there is a bill that's moving in Georgia, House Bill 673, and it's aiming to retroactively expand the First Offender Act to children that were tried as an adults. And so I think this goes back to what I was saying about, folks getting second chances, and like especially folks that, committed acts while children. And so it did actually have some hearings, and it's moving, and it's seeming promising. And it seems like the prosecuting attorneys council, they had some concerns, but were able to it's seeming like they, are willing to concede some stuff, and that might move through. I don't know. Doug might have a little bit more information on that, but I do think that's something promising and a good note. I do think in the system as a whole, we should, raise the age, and children should be treated as children. And because that also leads to the exacerbation of all these other issues that we've talked about throughout our system. And so any type of relief to children, well, they're now adults, but that were tried with children, I think is a good thing.
Well, let me jump in. I mean, I'm familiar with that bill, Fallon, and we've looked at it, and I hope it has some legs. I know that it's got a Democrat on the top line, on the signature line, which doesn't usually doesn't vote too well. But anyway, but yeah, in that factor, anyway, I can. But we have one of the bills we've been working on for years, at least a good 3, and it actually had crossed over last year, but on the edge of being passed on sine die. But well, there's always things don't always make it all the way across. But it's probably physically the largest bill we've worked on, and it's the intersection of criminal records and occupational licensing reform, which we've had a lot of clients who, and we work with a number of players, businesses, and even the technical school system, and it's sort of this blind spot for a lot of institutions, and they think, well, we'll just get this training. Person gets ready, trained, and then graduates, and they go off to go get the job or even the internship. In the hospital, particularly healthcare is a great one. They say they won't even let them on the floor, right? Because they've got this criminal record. So this intersection is a huge deal. With 1 in 6 jobs in Georgia, it requires an occupational licensing, and the healthcare industry has been very supportive of this movement. So we're excited about this bill. It's SB 207. I got to remember all the numbers. SB 207. It's going to start moving after crossover day. After crossover day, because it's already crossed last year. We also have a bill that sort of reworks first offender, so that if you plead the first offender. If you plead a first offender case in Georgia, Alabama, don't know anything about Alabama on this, but in Georgia, if you do a first offender case and you complete it successfully, it's not a conviction. It's a powerful tool. It's around since the 60s. But what happens too often is if you go to court and you plead guilty, and you're under probation or whatever for a few years, that record still shows up when you go to apply for a job. So it's counterintuitive that people who are being given the chance to not have a record at all, not have a conviction, that their record stops them from, the moment they walk out the courthouse. And this is when 98% of everybody on first offender successfully completes it in Georgia, according to the data we got. So that bill would sort of shut down people's records the moment they take that plea in court. that bill also crossed over, and we're excited about that. So there's some good things happening. I think I would just say this. I think the trick for us has always been to try to find overlapping interests. I think we are in the Deep South, and I am one, and I am one. I don't want to be yelling or talking or even whispering in an echo chamber. I think I want to get some stuff done. I think those of us who want to get some stuff done, which is all of us, but we've got to find ways of finding what the other party, the other side of the aisle is interested in, where their interest, and then overlap that with the interests of our clients and the interests that we're pushing for. And that's I think there's more. I think if we do that, I'm getting more to preaching here, but sorry, Sarah. But I think if we do that, we can have more successes. And I think it just requires us to be mentally and a little spiritually flexible sometimes to sort of find those spaces.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're at a point where we can turn to a couple of questions that have been submitted, except Kathy's just informed me that we're getting close to time. One quick question that came up in the chat, though, was is the federal government in any way involved in prisons in either Georgia or Alabama? I know we talked earlier about these investigations that were occurring, but is there any involvement at this point, or is this all left to the states at this point to address any issues that were revealed?
We were told by the federal government to do certain things, but have they actually came in and taken over our prisons? No. But we were, however, told by the federal government to complete certain things. So that's about it.
That's where it was left. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I don't think there's any takeovers of the federal. There's been, even in Middle Georgia, there was a case a couple of weeks ago where a judge in, I think, Macon, a federal judge in Macon, actually just totally jumped all over the head of the Department of Corrections for. There's all this like looking into it, but there's no real takeover. There's at least some pressure. Senator Ossoff from Georgia who helped pass a bill nationally, wrote a bill nationally that really looked at that at the federal level. But there's not a lot of that happening at the state level. The feds sort of intervening at the state level. So I don't see that. I don't know if Fallon has any other experience with that.
I haven't really seen at the state level. The most recent thing I can think of course, is just the DOJ consent decree for some jails, but not prisons.
thank you. Well, I'm going to follow directions, and I'm going to hand it back over to Nicola and Kim.
Can you come off mute?
Yeah. Do you want to go first, Nicola, or do you want me to go first? Okay, so I'm just going to wrap it up, and I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists and the moderator. You guys did such a great job. This is such an important topic that really I don't think gets enough attention. So I would just like to give a few events that are coming up for the League. And one of them is tied in directly to what we talked about tonight. It is the No More Lives Lost Vigil, which is associated with the Alabama Solution documentary, and it's a vigil for those who have lost their lives while in prison. It is tomorrow, so if you're in Montgomery at the Alabama State Capitol steps at 10 a.m. So if you're in the Montgomery area or feel like traveling there tomorrow, that would be a great way to sort of follow up on this panel. And then also on Thursday, February 26th, the Alabama League is having a forum, The Power of the People, Understanding Citizen Ballot Initiatives, and that is online. And I'm going to drop a document in the chat with this information and links to register as well. And then, of course, in March 6th through the 8th is the Selma Jubilee. And we have a disability voting rights panel on Saturday the 7th that we would love for you to attend. And of course, please join us for Bridge Crossing on Sunday at around 1 o'clock, kind of varies. But there's a link to the event schedule in this document as well. And also, it is, of course, our legislative session. And so if you would like to follow legislation in Alabama and are interested in what's happening, I'm going to drop a link to our Take Action Tuesday newsletters, which gives you calls to action, things you can do, and just updates on all of the bills. So that will be in the chat for you. And again, thanks to everyone for attending this evening. Nicola?
Thank you so much, Kathy. Kathy and Kim, sorry, is the case of Alabama. Greatly appreciate everything in the panel. What a great conversation that we had today. Very informative. Once again, same thing with Kim. We have a couple of activities. We are in the middle of our short session. We are just a few weeks from crossover here in Georgia, but our advocacy is really busy. Tomorrow we are having Mental Health Day at the Capitol. After is our first of two youth at the Capitol, where we're bringing a couple of high schools up to the Capitol to understand how it works, meet their representatives. The 24th is, of course, our ERA, which is a huge initiative with LWV in general. And then we have 2 days, February 24th and February 25th. And let's say our Sine Die Day for our legislative session is April 2nd. If you are interested in anything that has to deal with our advocacy, I will put in a chat to reach out to our advocacy vice president. She can definitely get you in contact with what we're doing at the state capitol. If you are in Atlanta, especially the greater Atlanta area, on March 5th, we are hosting what we're calling the Power of Four, unapologetically leading the new era of civil rights. It is the first time in modern history, and probably in all history in the state of Georgia, that 4 of the major organizations in our nation, in the state of Georgia, is being currently ran by 4 Black women. And we just think that this is a historical move. We have never, it's either been a Black male, it's been a white woman. It's never aligned where all 4 of us are, all 4 organizations are representing. We are representing the ACLU of Georgia, the League of Women Voters of Georgia, the NAACP of Georgia, and the Urban League of Greater Atlanta. And looking back, like I said, this is history in making, especially when the NAACP just elected their second woman as a state president. So we just feel like this is a great time to talk about the intersectionality of being a woman in this industry, or in this era, and then long and less being a Black woman. And how does that work when we're fighting civil rights? And what does that look like for the state of Georgia? And how do we move forward in that aspect? So that is March 5th. It is on our Facebook page. We will get that link out there when we post. And just once again, just want to say thank you so much. Our thing is legislate. I'll send our advocacy at lwvga.org if you're interested in doing some work at the state capitol. Thank you.